I lift up my eyes to you, Spirit who lives among us and beyond us, Spirit of the living God. Fall afresh on me, on us. Jesus said that those who wanted to worship must do so in spirit and in truth. And so we begin this morning, come, Spirit, come. And the truth is, with my partner Patrick away at camp, I did not get to ask my crucial Sunday morning question. How do I look? That is the last, thank you. That is the last thing I do before I leave home to come down to church on a Sunday morning. And I realized this morning that asking the how do I look question means that I trust Patrick to tell the truth in a general kind of way. Right? I don't need a detailed list of all the things that are wrong with how I look. I just need the truth about the general presentation in relation to a particular situation. And I'm not going to a picnic, and I'm going to this pulpit. And I'm not asking for an evaluation of how I look up against some standard, some absolute standard of beauty. Oh my God, no. I'm only asking for a general, relative assessment about the choices I have made, with some mercy along the way, about things that I cannot change. So it turns out that this question, as I've been thinking about it, how do I look, is actually a very complicated social interaction that requires some trust and some discernment. And that's all the more true in an internet culture, right? Where images can be manipulated and decontextualized. How do I look is an even bigger question if Facebook is involved. I have a clergy colleague who has introduced me to the concept of optics. Do you know optics? That how our faith communities look is important, not as a matter of vanity, but as an expression of our values. For instance, if we say that our faith calls us to welcome the stranger and to care for the immigrant, we have to be aware of the optics we are creating. If we care, we have to look like we care. And this isn't just about how other people look at us, it's about how we look at the world and at ourselves in the world. So the psalm this morning calls us to ask the how do we look question, both how we present ourselves to the world and how we see ourselves in it. Psalm 123 is one of 14 psalms of ascent, of going up. The most famous of which is probably Psalm 121. I love that psalm. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from God, who is maker of heaven and earth. You know that psalm? These particular psalms, we're told, are about hope and thanksgiving on the pilgrimage of life. It's like if you ask someone, so how are things going? And they say, I think things are looking up. That's these psalms. Things are looking up. Barbara Gibson's version of this psalm, as we heard from Jim, is, I lift up my eyes to you, Spirit, as the eyes of a child look to the face of her mother, so my eyes look to you, waiting for love and compassion. The idea is that how we look at things has an impact on how we experience the world. You know that, right? There's the glass half full people and the glass half empty people. How you look at the world impacts how you experience it. The problem is that sometimes we get stuck in ways of looking at the world that are left over from some other time or some other place that don't really help us very much. For instance, maybe you noticed this. In the standard version of Psalm 123 in our hymnal that Anita read for us, the psalm says, "As the eyes of subjects look to the hand of their ruler, so our eyes look to the sovereign, our God, until God has mercy upon us." Now, I have to say that when I read this, an image does come to mind that involves our dog, Cooper. See, I'm sitting in my chair. Cooper comes to sit by me, and he looks up at me with those big eyes, waiting for some treat to be dispensed from the sovereign hand of his master. Now, it is true that there is some question about who controls whom in our household. But in a way, it feels like that's the image we have in the standard version of Psalm 123. We are like Cooper, waiting for the master to drop some treats down from on high. That way of looking at God and the world, in my experience, isn't very helpful anymore. And I don't think I'm alone in that, because when Barbara Gibson does her adaptation of this psalm, she says, "As the eyes of a child," not a subject, "as the eyes of a child look to the face of her mother," not a sovereign ruler, "so my eyes look up to you." And I'll point out that while the standard version says that as subjects look to the hand of their sovereign, Gibson says, as the eyes of a child look to the face of her mother. Do you get the distinction between those two things? In other words, there is a way of looking at the world and ourselves in the world that can completely change the dynamics of our relationships, from trying to figure out who's in charge and hoping for some dispensation of mercy, to beloved ones looking into each other's eyes with love and compassion. Pastor Anita has arrived. Amen to that. We have been waiting. We have been waiting, and we're so glad that you are here. Pastor Anita has arrived, having graduated from Vanderbilt Divinity School. So I thought I should mention that Sally McFaig, right? That Sally McFaig, one of the great environmental feminists, was a professor at Vanderbilt. And she wrote a book 30 years ago that is still a classic, Models of God. McFaig wrote that in this time of ecological crisis, it's time to move away from models of God that seem to contribute to unhealthy, even destructive ways of looking at the world. From God as king, I got this right, Pastor Anita? From God as king, ruler, master, to God as mother, lover, friend. Now, that's not to say that those other models didn't serve some purpose for those who needed to claim a loyalty above those oppressive powers that be. Right? For the Hebrew Bible to say that only God is king, ruler of the universe, was to say that Pharaoh was not. Amen? Right? For the early Christians to say Jesus is Lord was to say Caesar is not. I'm not saying that those ways of looking at God and the world don't serve some purpose. They do. But it is to say that those models alone may not help us see the world with the kind of eyes that are necessary to create other dynamics and other relationships that can heal ourselves and the world. We need to imagine new models for the relationship between ourselves and our earth, McFaig writes. We can no longer see ourselves as namers of and rulers over nature, but must think of ourselves, and here are some models. Think of ourselves in relation to God as gardeners. Some of you are gardeners, right? Caretakers, mothers and fathers, stewards, trustees, We don't have a trustee board at this church. Maybe we should. Trustees, lovers, priests, co-creators, and friends of a world that, while giving us life and sustenance, also depends increasingly on us. I want to be clear this morning. The models that we use to look at the world matter. I lift up my eyes to you as the eyes of a child look to the face of her mother. I lift up my eyes to you. And one writer points out that the psalm makes us not underestimate not only the power of not showing up, but the power of making eye contact. Last week, a week ago Saturday, when we were at the rally and protest at the detention center in SeaTac, there were lots of speakers, as there usually are, and a lot of our attention was focused up front or over at the detention center, where, frighteningly, there were people on the roof looking down at us. It's kind of a weird feeling. But one speaker said, the most important thing we could do today is for you to turn to someone you don't know and say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so. I'm in it for the long haul." Wow. I turned to the three people behind me I did not know. 3 different people of color. And I got to say, "Hi, my name is Tim. I'm in it with you for the long haul." Eye contact. And then I happened to be reading, I just never underestimate the power of the Spirit to show up. I was just happening to read this article by a Harvard scholar about Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. Does anybody know this book? About the ways history teaches us to resist authoritarian regimes. Just happened to be reading this. I was brought up short when the article moved from public action to more private forms of resistance. What people who were vulnerable under repressive regimes remembered later, Snyder says, is how their neighbors treated them. During the purges in Eastern Europe and Nazi Germany, a greeting or a handshake meant a great deal. Such gestures made those who were vulnerable to the violence of the regime feel safer, but when their neighbors averted their eyes when they met, or crossed the street to avoid them, those same people felt more fearful, and with good reason. People who are isolated in society are much easier for authoritarian regimes to harm than those who are held, seen, and remembered in community. Making eye contact. There it was. Making eye contact and exchanging greetings are practices by which we recognize each other's humanity and knit each other into a shared life. I have never thought of eye contact as an act of resistance, as a model for a spiritual practice of how we look at ourselves in the world, but there it is. And I shouldn't be surprised, because if eyes are the window to the soul, they don't just simply receive information, they also reveal it. In this psalm, both the Standard Version and Barbara Gibson's version, she talks about suffering enough contempt, more than enough failure, more than enough self-doubt. We can see all those, right? We can see all those things in people's eyes. I have seen contempt in people's eyes. Amen. I have seen it. And I have seen compassion. I have seen failure in people's eyes. And I have seen forgiveness. I have seen self-doubt in people's eyes. And I have seen courage. Our eyes give us away. See, when I ask Patrick, how do I look on a Sunday morning, I trust he will tell me the truth in a big picture kind of way, not giving me a detailed list of all the things that are wrong with how I look. And I think how we look at the world is about the truth of a bigger picture, not a detailed list of all the things that are wrong. See, I grew up among fundamentalist folks. And oh boy, did they have a long, detailed list about what was not only wrong with the world, but what was wrong with me. And I can tell you, that did not help me. I had to let that model of God go away. And truthfully, some of the liberal prophetic voices don't help me very much either. Their detailed list of what's wrong in the world is different, but it has the same effect. The how do I look question is about a bigger picture. I always like to say, Jesus sort of coming out to his hometown is when he stands up in the synagogue and reads from Isaiah, "The Spirit of God is upon me to bring good news to the poor. The poor don't need any more bad news. They don't need a detailed list of what's wrong with the world. They know that. The Spirit is on me to bring good news. Good news, the bigger picture." When I ask Patrick, how do I look, I don't need to be judged against some absolute standard of beauty, because I'm just asking how appropriate am I relative to the situation I'm about to enter. And I think how we look at ourselves in the world is not trying to measure up to some absolute standard of perfection. Could we finally just get rid of that? It doesn't help anybody. It is about the best we can do to present ourselves for the circumstances at hand. When I ask Patrick how do I look question, I'm asking for a big picture and a relative assessment of the choices I've made with some mercy along the way about things I cannot change. Perhaps that's why I love that old chorus from Great Is Your Faithfulness. Did you notice that? Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Yesterday's mercies might not be enough. I need new mercies for this morning. I look in the mirror in the morning. I say to myself, how do I look? Morning by morning, new mercies I see. The point is, I trust Patrick with that complicated question, how do I look? Because of what I see in his eyes. What I see in his eyes is love and compassion and hope and wanting the best for me. What does the world see in our eyes? What kind of eye contact are we making? I lift up my eyes to you, Spirit, as the eyes of a child look to the face of her mother. So my eyes look up to you, looking to be met with those eyes of love and compassion and mercy. Several years ago, Rod Romney wrote words to a familiar old Scottish ballad. We lift our hearts, we bring our lives, just as we are without disguise. The how do I look question isn't about how good a disguise you're wearing, how colorful the mask is that hides your identity. How do I look is an invitation to take down those disguises, to put away those masks so you can be seen with the eyes of love and compassion and mercy that are just waiting for you. And if you do that, the world may look like a very different place. So today, if you hear that voice calling you to take down those disguises and to lift up your eyes, well, for God's sake, do not harden your hearts.